Hello, everyone. Welcome to Gen Z Capitalist. I've been posted for a while. I was traveling for work last week, and it's been really busy, especially before Thanksgiving. A lot of things are ramping up, so I only have time. Even I finish work late sometimes. After work, I must have some time to record some video. So today we're going to talk about why the Federal Reserve's checkmated and what is actually the Federal Reserve, because a lot of people have a misconception about it. So. A lot of people have this feeling about the Federal Reserve as if it's part of the government and it's supposed to keep things steady for the people, right? But there are a few fundamental things that are wrong. First of all, it is not part of the government. It is a private organization. Think about money as a product, right? You are able to go to the store and exchange money for goods. That the money itself is actually a service because if it didn't have a stable money, um, you wouldn't be able to trade with anybody. Like you have to barter, you have to trade your eggs with other people's beef, right? So money itself is actually a service. So I think about Federal Reserve as a service provider. Federal Reserve is a private organization, and the shareholder are actually, the banks. The CEO of all of the banks have a share in the Federal Reserve because the dollar is a product for people to use. You can use dollar to buy things easy enough, right? So, first of all, this is for entertainment purpose only, not financial advice at all. But there are other currencies, other things that are a product, like Bitcoin is a product, right? Um, what problem is it trying to solve? Like most of the time, product is trying to solve a problem, right? The Bitcoin is actually solving the problem that the government is printing too much money or the government is spending too much money. Um, but Federal Reserve has no responsibility to take care of you. In fact, as a private organization, it has a responsibility to make money for the shareholder. But why does Fed actually try to keep things stable, right? Like if you say the Federal Reserve has no interest in keeping the economy stable, that is wrong as well. The Fed definitely has interest because it turns out they're a service provider. I think the Federal Reserve is a company. If they do not provide good services, the customer can leave, right? They can go to other currencies. And so it's still this self-serving interest that keep the Federal Reserve try to keep things relatively stable. Because if the dollar crash, people figure out it's actually a scam and people don't trust the fractional reserve system anymore, the Federal Reserve actually has a lot to lose. But why do I say it's checkmated, right? Federal Reserve, their product is the US dollar. They do not ever want to admit their product is poor or bad, right? Even if they admit there's high inflation, it's strategic because they cannot lie. Because think about them as a company. They're selling you this product called US dollar. If they just lie to you, nobody's going to believe them. Like they can't just outright lie to you. But what they can do is they can hide their intentions. They're not going to tell you what they really think. First of all, the inflation is still super high, right? Like people can feel it. Like the real inflation rate is much higher than the CPI. The CPI is only a specific basket of good, but in reality, people almost everybody wants more than what's in the CPI. People want to go on vacation. People want to, go out to eat. And, a lot of these experiences are not factored in the CPI. Back in the day, like your budget, like you can go to a movie theater or you can go to a show. And now, you have Netflix. So they can do a hedonic adjustment. So like you're having the same standard of living. But here's the thing. If the inflation is so high, why doesn't the Federal Reserve hike interest rate? Actually, since Trump won the election, the long-term interest rate actually went up because people, the market is factoring in, there will be high inflation and the Federal Reserve will eventually increase the interest rate. But why don't they do it now? Like, why are they still trying to cut interest rate? Because they're checkmated. Because interest rate, it implies for a lot of things. Right now, uh, the interest rate is actually the rate where the government can borrow money. You buy bonds, and a lot of people are surprised. Oh, it's so nice. I don't have to pay taxes on the bonds. Of course you don't, because the money you earn is actually the debt of the government. It's actually the interest payment. If the government can tax their interest payment, This entire game, it just screwed up, Like, think about this. You lend me money, I borrow money from you. And when I pay you back, of course I cannot charge tax or interest on that because, you literally loan me the money. If the Federal Reserve starts charging money tax on that, nobody will buy the bonds. Okay, but you actually cannot just increase the interest rate. If you look at the national debt, just look at the data. It's shooting all the way up. And a lot of that is actually caused by the previous rate hike. Because when you increase interest rate, of course, people are more encouraged to save. But remember, the number one thing economics, nothing is free, right? Nothing is free. Physics do not lie. There's no miracle on earth. They have the power to make certain decision, but ultimately some people have to pay the cost. So when the interest rate goes up, yeah, you saw a temporary, actually the M2 supply, which is one way to look at the money supply, it stopped, right? It actually didn't increase much. It dipped a tiny bit and now it's actually going back. Because the high interest rate, people are spending less, saving more, but the national debt also explodes. So when the inflation comes, right, people just say, why don't you just increase interest rate? Because the national debt is at an unprecedented level. And that's why it's checkmated. People don't want the Federal Reserve don't want you to understand this. They want you to think everything is fine, right? They have things under control. Right now, they're kind of forced to lower the interest rate, even though the debts keep climbing, because at least it will be cheaper to borrow. Um, if you look at Japan or maybe China right now or in the future, you can even have negative interest rate because people are saving so much. Um, the government spends money, but it's actually not very expensive to pay back the debt. You can have a huge debt, um, and if your interest rate is really low, the interest payment is low. So you can just keep borrow. But obviously that poses a lot of issue. That's why, US economy has done much better than uh, both of the country I mentioned earlier. But now the US national debt is still in the unprecedented level. You know, there are a lot of speculation on what President Trump is going to do. I don't know. I'm just waiting to see, right? I can try to give my opinions, but one thing about my entire investment strategy is that my opinions don't matter. Think about this. My investment strategy, which I'm thinking about doing like a live portfolio tracker or something. So I don't want to share exactly what I buy all of the trades, but if I share often enough the weekly fluctuations for people to see, um, people know I'm not lying. But my entire strategy is that I'm stupid, right? Because the typical investor loses money because they're so arrogant. Like they just think they know everything. If you think you know more than the market, you are wrong. And the market is huge. There are so many people, people invest in nuclear energy, they can be nuclear engineer themselves. And in a certain domain, of course, I'm not saying my strategy is correct. People can understand what they're doing. But my strategy is I want to be as ignorant as possible. I want to take my opinion out of the equation because everybody has an opinion. If you ask 3 million people, there are 3 million opinions, but none of those opinions really matters because if you look at their performance, they don't really yield a good result. But we see this trend of inflation coming because the national debt is actually also forced inflation. If the government keeps spending, right, and they increase interest rate, so why do they have to increase interest rate? Because they have to increase the incentive for people to lend their money. If the interest rate is at zero, I mean, nobody's going to buy the treasury bonds. So, um, if they don't have much treasury bond buyers, then they really have to do quantitative easing, which weakens the currency even more. So what I'm saying is, again, this is for entertainment purpose only, but nobody can stop this inflation train. And people who think they're just lying to themselves because there are two ways, right? There are two ways to really deal with this. First is Trump really cut spending, right? This government spending really gets hammered. Right now, in one of my previous videos, I talked about the government makes about more than 4 trillion and spends about 6 trillion. So there's like 2 trillion deficit. Um, even if you cut 2 trillion, which is almost impossible, I follow a lot of conservative influencers on the internet, right? And I look at the number they're posting. So they're talking about this cut certain billion and this. And even I saw something cutting like a couple 100 million. It is a lot of money for everyday people. But if you think about you want to cut $2 trillion, right? And people were talking about they want to cut like 5 billion. Like 5 billion is a lot of money, but it's nothing in terms of government spending. So even with, the Republican social media influencers, I don't think they have really presented like a serious plan. Because on the other hand, you cannot just cut all of the government employee, right? Even though they're inefficient, like you cannot have like 10 million people unemployed overnight. There will be riots on the street. So number one is possible, but I don't see how it can happen. Um, the number two is gonna just go with the flow. Actually, maybe decrease interest rate. Obviously, national debt is not as bad as like Japan, but if you lower interest rate, actually the cost to borrow money is actually lower. Um, but obviously that poses a problem too, right? That's why I want to finish this video by what I say. The Fed is checkmated because interest rate is not magical, right? It just controls how expensive borrowing money is. Um, if you don't decrease interest rate, young people cannot afford houses, people have to borrow. In fact, when the currency gets devalued, people who borrow the most actually have an advantage, and a lot of young people actually and then had the opportunity to kind of borrow and then just wait and wait. When the currency gets devalued, normally people like it because the currency gets weakened and your debt becomes less significant. And that's what the government's trying to do. So, um, yeah, if the Federal Reserve decrease interest rate, people borrow more, I'm2 will explode, there will be more and more money supply. And if the Federal Reserve hikes interest rate, the national debt will go through the roof. Remember one thing, the Fed does not have to care about you. It has to care about its own interest. And everything the Federal Reserve does is for its own interest. And if you're a real capitalist, you don't want everybody else to do bad because nobody would actually buy your product. That's why, when Warren Buffett said, I wouldn't pay a dollar for all of the Bitcoin in the world. Of course, because if you own all of the Bitcoin in the world, it doesn't work. It's pointless. The idea of money is actually everybody has some, so you can trade with other people. If you have all of the US dollar in the world, that money is nothing, right? Literally, it cannot buy you anything because nobody else has it. So it's the network. It's the network. That's why the US was able to get off the gold standard. It was fine. You don't have to have um like a base currency. Of course, it might be better if you do, which I think the dollar will eventually get on a Bitcoin standard um in a subtle way. Even though people might not say it, but I think it's going to attract so much capital and it's going to be essentially effectively a system of a Bitcoin dollar. But ultimately, think about the US dollar as a product. It is a product that gives you convenience in life. And that product is maintained by the banks. So the banks really are a service provider. They're doing all of these things just so you can have a slightly more convenient life. But always remember, nothing's free. So there might be alternatives out there. And always think about what you're sacrificing in the current system. Thank you very much.